In post-war Germany, money meant almost nothing. Banknotes still existed, but they could no longer buy food, warmth, or safety. Shops stood open with empty shelves, price lists hung meaninglessly in windows, and salaries were paid for work that could not keep a family alive. The war had ended, but survival had entered a far more uncertain phase. A phase ruled not by bombs or soldiers, but by hunger. What replaced money was desperation, and desperation quickly created its own economy. Cigarettes became the most valuable currency in the country, especially American cigarettes brought in by occupying forces. They were small, easy to hide, and universally trusted. One cigarette could buy a loaf of bread, a few could secure milk for children, a full pack might trade for meat or coal, enough to heat a room for a night. People who had never smoked learned their value quickly. Cigarettes were counted carefully, hidden in shoes, sewn into coats, and guarded more closely than cash. Across the ruins of German cities, unofficial markets appeared almost overnight. In bombed-out train stations, shattered town squares, and empty lots between collapsed buildings, people gathered quietly. These were not places of greed or crime in the traditional sense. They were places of survival. Officially, the black market was illegal, but everyone knew it was impossible to stop. Police officers often turned away, not because they approved, but because they understood. They too were cold and hungry. Women became the backbone of this shadow economy. With men dead, imprisoned, or returning broken from the war, mothers and grandmothers took responsibility for keeping families alive. They traveled for hours, sometimes days, carrying bags, suitcases, or handcarts filled with whatever valuables remained. Wedding rings, silver cutlery, family photographs, pocket watches, and heirlooms passed down for generations were traded away for food or fuel. These journeys became known as hamster trips, as women traveled to rural areas hoping to exchange possessions for potatoes, turnips, or grain. Many returned empty-handed. Farmers had little to spare, and some demanded more than families could give. Hunger reshaped morals. Acts that once felt unthinkable became necessary. Children learned early that survival meant watching closely, listening carefully, and acting fast. They searched railway lines for coal fallen from passing trains, risking injury or arrest. They scavenged through rubble for anything that might be traded. A piece of chocolate, once a child's treat, became a tool for negotiation. Hunger erased childhood quickly. Public transport barely functioned. Trams froze on their tracks. Trains stopped in open fields, leaving passengers to walk for hours through snow and darkness. Factories stood silent, not because workers were unwilling, but because there was no fuel to power machines. Without work, there was no income, and without income, even ration cards lost meaning. Official food rations promised survival, but reality delivered constant hunger. Daily calorie intake dropped dangerously low, especially for the elderly, the sick, and children. Bread was stretched with substitutes. Soup was watered down. Meals were skipped entirely. Many Germans later said that this period felt worse than the war itself. During the bombings, there had been an enemy, a moment when sirens stopped and survival felt possible. In these years, there was no warning, no pause, only the slow, relentless pressure of hunger that invaded every thought. Each morning began with the same question: how will we eat today? And each night ended with the same fear: what will be left tomorrow? Be left. As hunger tightened its grip, the black market stopped being an exception and became the system itself. Almost everyone depended on it, even those who pretended not to. Teachers, clerks, factory workers, and former officials all found themselves standing in ruined squares, quietly negotiating like strangers in a foreign world. Trust was fragile. Deals were made in whispers, eyes constantly scanning for patrols or thieves. A wrong trade could mean days without food. A bad exchange could cost a family its last chance to survive the winter. Cigarettes continued to dominate this underground economy, but they were not the only form of currency. Soap, chocolate, coffee, and canned goods carried enormous value, especially items brought by Allied soldiers. A single bar of soap could be traded for vegetables. Coffee, almost impossible to obtain legally, became a luxury worth more than money. Even clothing gained new importance. A warm coat might be worth more than a week of food, yet many still traded them away, gambling against the cold in favor of hunger. Women carried the heaviest burden. They learned how to bargain hard, how to hide fear, and how to walk for miles without showing exhaustion. Many left before dawn, pushing carts through snow-covered roads toward the countryside. These journeys were dangerous. Some were robbed. Others were turned away by farmers who feared punishment or simply had nothing left. Yet they kept going because staying meant watching children grow weaker by the day. Children themselves became part of this economy. They learned which stations were safest, which guards could be distracted, and when coal trains slowed enough for pieces to fall. Groups of children waited silently along frozen tracks, ready to rush forward the moment a train passed. The coal they gathered was heavy and filthy, but it meant warmth, or something to trade for food. Many were injured, some were caught, but most returned again and again, driven by necessity rather than choice. Morality shifted under pressure. Stealing food was no longer seen as crime, but as survival. Neighbors who once judged such acts now looked away or quietly helped. Police officers faced impossible decisions. Enforcing the law strictly meant condemning people to starvation. Many chose compassion over orders, ignoring small trades and focusing only on violence or theft that threatened lives directly. The state's authority weakened, replaced by an unspoken understanding that survival came first. Illness spread rapidly in these conditions. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and infections thrived in cold, crowded rooms. Hospitals were overwhelmed and underheated. Doctors worked with frozen hands, lacking medicine, equipment, and even basic supplies. Patients lay wrapped in coats and blankets, their breath visible in the air. Some survived, many did not. Funerals became smaller and quieter, not out of respect, but exhaustion. Psychological strain deepened. People who had endured years of bombing and loss now felt crushed by something slower and more relentless. Hunger invaded thoughts, dreams, and conversations. Letters from the time describe a sense of shame, of trading away the last symbols of a former life just to remain alive. Wedding rings disappeared. Family heirlooms vanished. The past was exchanged piece by piece for another day of existence. Yet even in this darkness, moments of humanity endured. Neighbors shared fires, taking turns feeding them through the night. Communal kitchens appeared where people pooled scraps to create something warm. Strangers helped push carts through snow without asking for payment. These small acts did not end hunger, but they preserved dignity. They reminded people that survival was not only physical, but moral. As months passed, it became clear that this was not a temporary crisis. Hunger was reshaping society itself, redefining values, relationships, and trust. Germany was not only rebuilding cities, but relearning how to live together under extreme pressure. And the cost of survival was far greater than anyone had imagined. By 1947, the struggle for survival had reached deep into every layer of German society. Hunger was no longer limited to the poorest or most vulnerable. Former professionals, teachers, engineers, and civil servants now stood alongside laborers and refugees, all reduced to the same daily concern: finding enough to eat. Social status lost meaning. Education offered no protection against an empty stomach. Pride became a luxury few could afford. People learned to hide their pasts, knowing that desperation erased former identities. Apartments grew colder as winter dragged on. Coal remained scarce, and electricity failed without warning. Families retreated into single rooms, sealing off the rest of their homes to conserve heat. Windows were covered with cardboard or cloth. Ice formed on the inside of walls. At night, silence settled heavily over the ruins, broken only by coughing, footsteps in the snow, or the distant rumble of trains. Sleep came in short, restless intervals, interrupted by hunger and cold. Children aged quickly in these conditions. School attendance dropped as weakness and illness spread. Some schools closed entirely due to lack of heating or teachers. Education felt meaningless when survival itself was uncertain. Many children were sent away to rural areas whenever possible, in the hope that farms might offer food and warmth. For parents, these separations were acts of love mixed with fear. Letters replaced voices. Weeks passed without news. Some children returned stronger. Others never returned at all. Rural life offered no guarantees. Snow buried fields. Livestock died from cold and lack of feed. Farmers struggled to survive themselves, often resenting the endless stream of desperate visitors from the cities. Tensions grew. Accusations of hoarding and exploitation circulated, even as everyone understood the fear that drove such behavior. Trust between city and countryside weakened, replacing solidarity with suspicion. Mental exhaustion spread quietly. People who had endured years of war now felt hollow. There was no dramatic moment of collapse, no single catastrophe to blame. Instead, hope eroded slowly, day by day. Suicide rates increased, especially among men who felt unable to provide for their families. Letters from the period speak of shame, failure, and an overwhelming sense of futility. Survival no longer felt like victory, but endurance without reward. The occupying authorities struggled to respond. Aid arrived inconsistently, often delayed by damaged infrastructure and harsh weather. When food shipments did arrive, they were rarely enough. Distribution systems were inefficient, sometimes corrupt, and always overwhelmed. Ration cards promised fairness, but reality delivered inequality. Those with connections, strength, or luck survived more easily. Those without faded quietly. Yet within this fragile society, something unexpected began to form. Shared suffering created unspoken bonds. People recognized themselves in one another's hardship. Small communities organized quietly. Neighbors pooled resources. Women coordinated childcare and cooking. Men repaired roofs, stoves, and carts with scavenged materials. These acts did not solve the crisis, but they prevented total collapse. A sense of collective endurance emerged, fragile but real. Slowly, the understanding grew that survival alone was not enough. People began to speak not just of enduring the present, but of preventing such suffering in the future. Conversations shifted from despair to cautious resolve. The question was no longer only how to survive today, but how to rebuild a society that would never again allow hunger to rule so completely. Germany stood on the edge, balanced between breakdown and transformation. And the choices made in these years would shape everything that followed. When spring finally arrived in 1947, it did not bring relief so much as exposure. As the snow melted, the full scale of destruction became visible again. Streets remained broken, buildings hollowed out, and entire neighborhoods stood silent, occupied by people who had survived but were deeply changed. Tens of thousands had died during the winter, not in battles or bombings, but quietly, from cold, hunger, and illness. Those who lived carried the winter with them, not as memory alone, but as a physical and psychological scar. The black market did not disappear overnight. It lingered, slowly shrinking as food supplies stabilized and coal deliveries improved. Cigarettes lost their power as currency. Money cautiously began to regain meaning. But the habits formed during those years did not fade so easily. People continued to save, to hide food, to distrust abundance. A full table felt unnatural. Warm rooms felt temporary, as if they could vanish at any moment. The experience reshaped priorities. For many Germans, concepts like stability, food security, and social responsibility became moral imperatives. Hunger had stripped life down to its essentials and revealed how fragile civilization could be. Political debates after the war were deeply influenced by these memories. Welfare systems, labor protections, and economic reforms were no longer abstract ideas. They were responses to lived suffering. The determination to prevent another winter like 1946 to 47 became part of the national consciousness. Families spoke of it quietly, often to children who could not imagine such conditions. The stories were not heroic. There were no victories, no triumphs, only endurance, only the slow, stubborn refusal to disappear. Many later said that surviving the war had required courage, but surviving the winter had required something harder, patience without hope. And yet, within that endurance, something essential had survived: community, responsibility. The understanding that survival was not an individual achievement, but a collective one. Neighbors who had shared fires and food remembered one another. Children who had scavenged coal together carried those bonds into adulthood. The Hunger Years became a silent foundation beneath the rebuilt cities, invisible but influential. Modern Germany rose from ruins not only through economic plans and political agreements, but through a shared memory of deprivation. The winter of 1946 to 47 and the hunger that followed were not just historical events. They were lessons written into daily life. They taught a generation what happens when systems fail, when dignity collapses, and when survival depends on solidarity rather than strength. Long after the black markets disappeared and shops filled again, the fear of empty shelves remained. It was a reminder of how quickly order can dissolve and how essential compassion becomes when it does. This period did not end with celebration. It ended quietly, with exhaustion giving way to rebuilding. But its legacy endured. Germany did not simply recover from hunger. It was reshaped by it. And the echoes of those frozen rooms, traded heirlooms, and silent markets continued to influence decisions for decades to come. The war may have destroyed the country, but hunger revealed its soul.